The Colorado River no longer reaches the sea. For 6 million years, it carved its way across the desert, ground out the Grand Canyon a single grain of sand at a time, and emptied into the Gulf of California in a vast green delta teeming with birds and fish and life. Today, if you follow the river south toward the border, you watch it shrink and slow, and finally vanish into cracked mud and salt flats miles before it ever tastes the ocean. The river that built the modern American West, the river that made the desert bloom and lit up the neon of Las Vegas and filled the swimming pools of Los Angeles, dies quietly in the sand. And after 100 years of engineering, litigation, and denial, we have to say something out loud that water managers across 7 states have spent decades trying not to say. The Colorado River has lost the fight. Not the fight against any one drought, the fight against arithmetic itself. To understand how enormous that is, you have to understand what this one river actually holds up. The Colorado is only about 1,400 miles long, modest by the standards of the world's great rivers, and yet it is the hardest working river on Earth. It supplies water to roughly 40 million people across 7 American states and part of northern Mexico. It irrigates about 5.5 million acres of farmland, some of the most productive cropland on the planet. The fields that grow much of the winter lettuce and vegetables that fill American grocery stores when the rest of the country is frozen. It generates billions of kilowatt hours of hydroelectric power every year. It sustains 30 Native American tribes. It is the reason cities that have no business existing in a desert, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and to a large degree Los Angeles and San Diego, exist at all. Take this river away, and the American Southwest as we know it simply collapses. That is the scale of what is now failing. And here is the thing that makes this a tragedy rather than an accident. We did it to ourselves, and we did it right at the very beginning, with a single catastrophic miscalculation baked into the foundation of the whole system. To grasp how completely the West bet everything on this river, look at what we built to control it. In the 1930s, in the depths of the Great Depression, thousands of workers descended into the black rock of Boulder Canyon to raise Hoover Dam, a wall of concrete so massive it still ranks among the greatest engineering feats in American history. It tamed a wild, flood-prone river and created Lake Mead, and it announced a new idea that with enough concrete and ambition, the desert itself could be conquered. Over the following decades came more dams, more canals, and vast aqueducts, reaching hundreds of miles to carry the river's water to cities that had no water of their own. Los Angeles, Phoenix, San Diego, Las Vegas, Tucson, all of them grew into the metropolises we know today on the strength of water borrowed from a single overworked river. Entire economies, tens of millions of lives, trillions of dollars of property and industry were stacked on top of that borrowed water, 1 decade at a time, as if the borrowing could go on forever. The confidence was total. The foundation was cracked from the start. In 1922, representatives of the western states gathered to divide the river among themselves. The agreement they produced, the Colorado River Compact, split the water between an upper group of states and a lower group, promising each half a generous share, with more later guaranteed by treaty to Mexico. It was, for its time, a monumental act of planning. There was just one fatal flaw. The men in that room divided up the river based on how much water they believed it carried, and they made their measurements during one of the wettest stretches in the region's recorded history. They assumed the river reliably carried around 16 or 17 million acre-feet of water every year. An acre-foot, by the way, is enough water to cover an acre of land a foot deep, roughly what 2 or 3 households use in a year. But the river they were dividing was a mirage. Over the long run, the Colorado's natural flow has averaged closer to 14.5 million acre-feet a year, and since the year 2000, in the grip of the worst drought the region has seen in more than a millennium, it has delivered only around 12 million. In other words, the founders of the modern West sat down and promised out more water than the river ever actually held. They wrote checks the river could not cash, and every generation since has been fighting over an overdrawn account. For most of the 20th century, that gap was hidden, papered over by big wet years and by the enormous reservoirs we built to store the surplus. But the debt never went away. it just waited. Those reservoirs are the two largest in the United States, and they are the clearest possible measure of how the fight is going. Behind the Hoover Dam sits Lake Mead. Upstream, behind Glen Canyon Dam, sits Lake Powell. Together, when full, they can hold several years' worth of the entire river's flow. They were meant to be the West's great savings account, a buffer thick enough to survive any dry spell. For 25 years now, that account has been draining, and it is very nearly empty. By the summer of 2026, Lake Mead had fallen to around 27% of capacity, hovering within a couple of feet of the lowest level ever recorded since the day it first filled in the 1930s. Lake Powell was worse. It dropped past its own all-time record, sinking toward levels that threatened the very machinery of the dam that holds it. Together, the two great reservoirs held only about a quarter of their combined capacity. Picture two enormous bank vaults, built to hold the fortune that keeps an entire civilization running, and picture them scraped down to the corners. That is not a forecast. That is where we are right now. Engineers have a cold, technical name for the reason those reservoirs keep dropping even in years that aren't especially dry. They call it the structural deficit. It means that the lower part of the river system loses well over 1 million acre-feet more water every single year than actually flows in, lost to evaporation off the reservoir surfaces and to the simple cost of moving water across a blistering landscape. Read that carefully, because it is the whole story in one sentence. Even in a normal year, the system goes backward. A structural deficit does not care about a good snow year. One wet winter does not fix it. It bleeds the reservoirs a little lower every year, relentlessly, unless the people who depend on the river agree to take dramatically less than they have grown used to taking. And for 100 years, nobody has been willing to do that. Now the falling water has exposed a danger almost nobody outside the world of dam engineers saw coming, and it turns the crisis from slow to potentially sudden. It lives inside Glen Canyon Dam. When Lake Powell drops low enough, the dam can no longer spin its turbines to make electricity. That threshold, called minimum power pool, sits at an elevation the lake has been creeping toward for months. Below it, the hydropower that helps run millions of homes across the region simply stops. But there is a deeper and more frightening line beneath that one. If Powell keeps falling, the water can only be sent downstream through a set of old bypass pipes deep in the dam, pipes engineers describe, with real alarm, as antique plumbing. Those pipes were never designed to carry the entire river for months or years on end. When they've been tested at low levels, they've shown damage, eaten away by the high-speed force of the water tearing through them. And below even those pipes lies the final line, dead pool, the elevation at which no water can be sent downstream at all. At dead pool, Lake Powell becomes a bathtub with no working drain, and everything below it, the Grand Canyon, Lake Mead, and the 40 million people who depend on what flows past, is cut off from the upper basin's water. This is not a theoretical nightmare from the distant future. Federal water managers have already been forced to act, releasing water from smaller reservoirs upstream in an emergency effort to prop Lake Powell up and keep it above the danger line, a rescue that will run for a year or more and that quietly drains those upstream lakes to buy time for the big one. They are, in effect, borrowing from the region's last few savings accounts to keep the biggest one from failing. It is the water equivalent of paying one credit card with another, and everyone involved knows it is not a solution, but a stall. What makes it worse is that fixing the dam's aging plumbing, the one repair that might actually address the underlying danger, has been left out of the official plans, tangled in cost and bureaucracy, and the basic reluctance to spend enormous sums on a problem no one wants to admit is this urgent. And the same downward pressure is squeezing Hoover Dam, where falling levels at Lake Mead steadily cut the power the dam can generate, threatening the electricity of hundreds of thousands of homes and the revenue that helps pay to run the whole system. Las Vegas, which draws almost all its water from Mead, saw the danger years ago and spent hundreds of millions of dollars drilling a new intake deep at the bottom of the lake, a so-called third straw, so it could keep pulling water even if the reservoir dropped below the levels at which its neighbors could reach it. The city essentially built a lifeboat and quietly climbed in, an admission, in concrete and steel, of exactly how bad the people closest to this river believe it can get. Las Vegas has also done something the rest of the region has mostly avoided. It has genuinely changed how it lives. The city banned new decorative lawns, paid residents to rip out grass and replace it with desert landscaping, recycled nearly every drop of water used indoors, and drove its total water use down even as its population exploded. It is proof that deep conservation is possible. But it is also a warning, because Las Vegas is a relatively small user of the river. Even its impressive savings are a rounding error against the volumes flowing onto farm fields. You cannot conserve your way out of this crisis by fixing the cities alone. And everyone who studies the river knows it. All of this collides with a deadline that has been hanging over the West like a storm front. The rules that currently govern how the river is shared during shortages, the rules that decide who takes cuts and how deep, expire at the end of 2026. For years, the 7 states that depend on the river have been trying, and failing, to agree on what replaces them. And the negotiations have curdled into something close to open conflict. The dispute breaks along an old fault line between the upper basin states, where the river is born in the snowpack of the Rockies, and the lower basin states, where most of the people and the biggest farms are. The upper basin argues it already gets shorted every year by nature, taking whatever the mountains provide, and should not be forced into fixed cuts on top of that. The lower basin argues that the pain has to be shared, that everyone has to give up water to keep the system alive. Deadlines have come and gone with no agreement. The states have traded dueling proposals and pointed fingers, and the federal government has warned that if they cannot agree, it may have to impose a solution none of them want. This is what losing the fight looks like in practice. Not a single dramatic collapse, but a room full of powerful people unable to agree on how to divide a shrinking pie, while the pie keeps shrinking. And when the cuts do come, they will not fall evenly. The state that agreed, decades ago, to stand first in line for reductions in exchange for federal money to build its canals is Arizona, and it has already absorbed brutal cuts that fell largely on its farmers. Under the plans being drawn up for the years ahead, Arizona would again give up the largest single share of the water. More than California, more than Nevada, more than anyone. But the single biggest user of Colorado River water is not a city or even a state. It is a farming region in the Southern California desert called the Imperial Valley, which holds some of the oldest and most legally protected water rights on the entire river, on its own. That one irrigation district uses more of the Colorado than the states of Arizona and Nevada draw from it individually. And what does it grow with all that water? Largely hay and forage crops, especially alfalfa, along with the winter vegetables that feed much of the country. The uncomfortable truth of the whole system is that the overwhelming majority of the river, somewhere around 70 to 80%, goes not to the taps of those 40 million people, but to agriculture, and a huge slice of that goes to growing feed for cattle. The story of the Colorado River drying up is, to a remarkable degree, the story of alfalfa. That fact is now forcing painful choices, and every choice seems to create a new disaster somewhere else. In the Imperial Valley, farmers have agreed to leave enormous amounts of water in Lake Mead, idling fields and cutting back irrigation in exchange for federal payments, hundreds of thousands of acre-feet meant to slow the reservoirs' fall. It helps the river, but it is killing a lake. For decades, the runoff from those Imperial Valley farms drained into the Salton Sea, California's largest lake. An accidental body of water created a century ago by a canal break. As farmers conserve water and less runoff reaches it, the Salton Sea is shrinking fast, exposing miles of dry lakebed laced with a century of pesticides and heavy metals. The wind lifts that toxic dust into the air of nearby communities, where children already suffer asthma at rates far above the national average. So here is the impossible math the West now faces. Save the river, and you poison the air. Save the lake, and you drain the river. There is no longer a painless choice anywhere in the system, because there is no longer any slack left in it. It would be comforting to blame all of this on drought, on a run of bad luck that a few wet winters could reverse. But the scientists who study the river are increasingly clear that this is something more permanent. The word they use now is not drought, but aridification, a lasting structural drying of the entire region driven by a warming climate. Hotter air pulls more moisture out of the soil and the snowpack before it ever reaches the river. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation off every reservoir. The river's flow has fallen by roughly 20% compared to the 20th century average, and a large part of that decline is now attributed directly to rising temperatures, not just a lack of rain and snow. Which means the water is not simply going to come back. The old normal, the wet, generous river that the men of 1922 thought they were dividing, is gone, and it is not returning. The West has to learn to live with a smaller river, permanently, and it has spent decades refusing to plan for that. Study after study, scientist after scientist, sounded the alarm going back 40 years and more, warning in plain language that the river was overpromised and that the reckoning was coming. Those warnings were filed away, softened, and postponed. Because acknowledging them meant telling someone, somewhere, that the growth had to stop. It was always easier to hope for a wet winter, to build one more subdivision, to sign one more water contract, and to leave the hard arithmetic to whoever came next. Now there is no one left to hand it to. We are the generation that ran out of next. Behind all the acre-feet and elevations and legal disputes, it is worth remembering what has already been lost, quietly, while the powerful argued over the remainder. The delta at the river's end, once one of the great wetland wildernesses of North America, larger than some states, has been reduced to a fraction of itself, a ghost of green in a wasteland of salt. The native fish that evolved in the river's warm, silty waters have been pushed to the edge of extinction, and the 30 tribal nations whose relationship with this river stretches back not decades, but thousands of years, have too often been the last consulted and the first to go without, their water rights acknowledged on paper and ignored in practice. Some of those tribes hold rights among the oldest and strongest on the entire river, rights that in theory sit ahead of the great cities, and yet many of their members have lived for generations without reliable running water in their own homes, hauling it in by truck while the water that is legally theirs flows past to fill distant swimming pools. As the river shrinks and every drop is fought over, those long-ignored claims are finally being pressed, adding one more powerful set of demands to a system that already promises far more than it can deliver. The river was a living thing, a relative, long before it was ever a resource to be divided into shares. That older truth got buried under concrete and litigation. And it is part of what has been lost in the fight. There have been small, hopeful gestures at repair, brief pulses of water deliberately released to the parched delta in recent years, enough to bring back a flush of green and a few returning birds for a season. But those were teaspoons offered to a patient who needs a river. They show what has been lost far more than they restore it. So when we say the Colorado River has lost the fight, we should be precise about what we mean. The river did not fail. The river did exactly what a river does. It carried the water the sky, and the mountains gave it, no more and no less. What failed was a promise, 100-year-old human promise that the desert could be made to bloom forever, that growth could go on without limit, that 7 states and 40 million people could keep drawing more from this river than it ever actually held, and that the reckoning could always be pushed onto the next generation. That promise has finally run out of road. The reservoirs cannot fall much further. The plumbing cannot bend much more. The deadline cannot be extended forever. The fight that remains is no longer the fight to save the old abundance. That fight is over, and the river lost. Or rather, we lost it on the river's behalf a century ago and simply refused to admit it. The only fight left is the one over who absorbs the loss. Which farms go dry? Which cities stop growing? Which tribes finally get the water they were promised? And which communities breathe the dust? Whether the states can share the pain like adults, or whether they force a judge or a bureaucrat to carve it up for them while the reservoirs keep dropping. That is the real negotiation happening right now across the West, dressed up in the polite language of operating guidelines and system conservation. The Colorado River built the American West. It made the impossible cities and the winter gardens and the neon glow in the middle of the desert. For 100 years, it hid our arithmetic from us, and we mistook its patience for endless supply. Now the account is empty, the buffer is gone, and the river is telling us, and falling water lines and cracked delta mud and toxic dust on the wind, the one number the men of 1922 never wanted to hear. There was never truly enough. There is even less now. And the desert, as it always does, patiently and without malice, is about to collect every last